and today we're going to be talking about the disinformation problem. This is a talk that I put together for Bournemouth 2600. It's kind of the talk that was designed to come before my Russian disinformation talk, and it was going to be a series of blog posts, but I thought, why not just make it a talk? It's always nice to talk through these things, and provide more context and more thoughts and things. Um, and yeah, I mean, this is a very, again, it's an introductory and entry level talk, but I think a lot of people have heard about disinformation and are concerned about it, but have never really done much of a deep dive themselves, and how it works and why it's happening. So that's the whole purpose and point of this talk. Um, Disinformation was kind of exemplified by the power of disinformation was really shown to, by early on through a simple game that a PhD researcher created, which was called the Werewolf Game. Some of you may have heard of this game before, but the basic premise of it is that if you have a town of villagers and the aim of the game is for the villagers to try and figure out who the werewolves are, all the werewolves have to do is try and, create stories, create fiction, and try and convince everyone that they aren't the werewolves. Whereas the villagers have to try and figure it out, and it's pretty difficult to try and figure out who these werewolves are because everyone is saying the same kind of thing and they can just say all sorts of lies and information, and because there's nothing else to base it on, um, basically most of the time the werewolves would always win the game because it's easy to deceive people when they have no information to base their sort of judgments on. So yeah, it's an interesting thought experiment to show the power of this information. And it's kind of a fun thing to play as well if you get a group of people together at some point. But it kind of reinforces the point of how disinformation works and why it's so powerful. So, what is disinformation in general? Um, there's a difference between disinformation and misinformation. Misinformation is kind of getting information spread that you heard something or you learned something, but you didn't hear it quite correctly, and you're kind of spreading that information without realizing, without knowing what the truth is. So some people sort of act as sources of authority, and they kind of end up just saying the wrong thing, but people trust them still. Um, the concept of disinformation is where people actually actively try to sow lies and intentionally distort the truth. They try to push a type of narrative or story that's completely fabricated and made up, with maybe hints of truth here and there. But the overall goal is to push something that's malicious and something that's not true, to control people, to make them feel a certain way, make them perform a certain action. Um, the ultimate goal of these disinformation campaigns that we see is to try and get a group of people to do something or feel something. Um, yeah, it's a confusing and difficult topic and a difficult thing to try and stop. It's always really going to be there. It always has been there. But we should be more conscious of it. Um, what are actual so disinformation campaigns is where you get kind of hostile states that are trying to target maybe us in the UK or us in the US. You've got countries like Russia and China and Iran that actually try and manipulate crises a lot of the time. They're often hijacking sort of events and incidents, putting those together and trying to push a certain narrative. You may have heard of things like QAnon or the deep state, and anytime there's some sort of major incident or crisis, they always say, "Oh, it's the deep state's fault" or something like that. So it always makes people feel skeptical of their governments, makes people distrust their governments and ignore their governments when, if they're given some sort of instructions and things. So basically what these disinformation campaigns lead to is nationalist isolationist movements domestically, which is exactly what the hostile adversaries want. They don't want the US or the UK or the European Union having influence over other countries and working together, because then that makes them a stronger alliance opposed to hostile states who want to break these countries down, these alliances down, and try and manipulate each country one by one. So why is countering disinformation so hard? Um, Quite a few reasons, really. It depends. It depends on quite a few things. Depends what country you're in. But take the UK, for example, to maintain a free and open system, you have to allow freedom of speech and expression. But that doesn't really, it's hard because then you're also allowing people to completely lie and distort the truth and say whatever. Um, it's kind of a funny issue in that to enable freedom of expression, you have to allow complete bold-faced lies, which is, that you can still call them out for it, but there's so much lies and disinformation that you can't stop everything, right? Um, and I mean, the alternative is censorship and blocking, which can't really be done without receiving a ton of backlash. It's why a lot of these big social media companies, when they begin blocking accounts and banning accounts, you kind of saw these other types of social media platforms popping up to spread, for people for them to continue spreading their lies and disinformation in a sort of echo chamber. It just shows how really hard it is to stop as an issue, but something we definitely need to be aware of. Who are the types of people and groups that actually start disinformation? What are the sources of this disinformation coming from? Um, for the most part, you'll see kind of pranksters and conspiracy theorists, scammers, people just straight up trying to lie for profit, malicious insiders, and then politicians as well. Classic five kind of perpetrators of spreading disinformation. Um, some of these again may be misinformation. They may have heard something, not fully understood it, taken it out of context and spread it, or some just completely make it up and spread it themselves for their own personal gain, whether it's financial, whether it's to make themselves laugh. You can imagine all sorts of online sites like 4chan and 8chan and all sorts of things. They shed and spread they shed and they spread and share these things for their own, entertainment, really. Um, Conspiracy theorists, you get a lot of them that are also scammers. A lot of them, they'll spread, take the flat Earth conspiracy theory, for example. Um, you see they always have some sort of merch shop where they're trying to sell, mugs and t-shirts and all sorts of things. Just basically tricking people into buying it, really. So if you try and kind of trace back to where some of these disinformation campaigns start, some of these kind of types of individuals will start popping up. Um, so the spreaders of disinformation, so you have the sources of disinformation and you have the spreaders of disinformation. The types of people that spread this stuff are, in my life, it could be my relatives. Some of my relatives may be seeing some of the stuff in the news, seeing it in group chats, seeing it in newspapers, wherever, and then sharing it, resharing it to their friends and family. And I'm sure this is how a lot of people actually start finding out about this stuff. People my age in sort of mid-20s or early 30s may have sort of older relatives that share this stuff, who aren't, kind of naive or not, didn't grow up with the internet and don't really understand that every day on the internet should kind of be treated like April Fool's Day is a fun little saying I've seen going around. Uh, One of the other real dangerous parts of it is celebrities. They have very large platforms. People trust them. Take Donald Trump, for example. Whenever he shares something, tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions of people are going to see it. And some people don't. Some people trust them amazingly. Some people actually believe what he says, and take it without any second thought or critical thinking. Um, the mainstream media, the news, all sorts of various news sites. a lot of them are, they are leaning one way or another politically, and anything that fits their narrative, they kind of boost it, they kind of reshare it. They say some of them will even say, it's unconfirmed from anonymous sources, but and we'll continue to watch it, but they still spread the bold-faced lie as well. Um, and another thing that sort of people in my industry, cybersecurity, independent researchers, we need to be aware of other accounts that are kind of more hobbyists. They're not doing it as their job. There's no responsibility for them to get it right. They just kind of participate in open source intelligence, and they kind of regurgitate things that they see on Twitter, on Facebook, or Instagram, or Telegram, or wherever without doing their own research, without figuring it out themselves. And that's how these things start to gain momentum and then are cited by others and sort of circular reporting you see as well. So always remain kind of skeptical of some of these anonymous OSINT accounts, because they're, again, a lot of the time they're just doing it for fame or for money, because, at the end of the day, you can make money off these things. Um, Something that Elliot Higgins talked about in his book on Bellingcat, which is a group of OSINT investigators who kind of pioneered this research. He spoke about something called the counterfactual community, and the counterfactual community is basically a group of online grifters and conspiracy theorists that they run all sorts of platforms and get money from it. So even if you try to engage with them, they just completely ignore you, shut you down. They start bringing up other irrelevant things that happened to kind of counter you. But it's just, it's like they constantly say, but what about this? But what about this? Instead of addressing a point directly. Um, so even if they are presented with the facts, they still just ignore it and say, "Oh, well, that may be true, but what about this?" It's a kind of a really annoying and circular way of arguing. And again, it just at the end of the day, it's a really hard thing to counter. Um, and Elliot Higgins, in his book, he said the funny thing about this counterfactual community is their motto is believe, insist, and ignore. So, if a news story pops up that has basically no credibility to it, some sort of video or screenshot from Twitter or Telegram, and then they share it. Someone says that's not anything to do with this specific conflict. That's from a conflict several years ago. They just ignore them. They don't delete their tweet. They don't apologize. They just carry on and continue to operate as if nothing happened. Um, so yeah, this is definitely the type of community we need to be keeping an eye on and being aware of as researchers online, because it's like an industry nowadays. And this industry has repercussions. Some of the absolute worst conspiracy theories are the types of things like how 5G is impacting the mass population's health negatively. There's basically been no research that supports these conspiracy theories. And the problem is, people do believe it and they do end up burning these towers down. So these 4G towers were actually being burned because people thought they were 5G towers. And the funny thing is, the upsetting thing is, these towers are being relied on by emergency services, right? By the ambulance, by the police, by the fire brigade. Uh, so if, someone is ill or hurt or in distress, you can't, the emergency services are kind of, not going to find out about it. So this is actually having a real negative impact on society physically in the real world, not just online. It's coming into the real world and affecting all of us now. Um, so for example, some common conspiracy theories that I'm sure most people have heard of these days, you've just your classic things like George Bush conducted 9/11. It was all planned and all the Mossad was involved, all this kind of just rubbish, made up rubbish, really. Um, but there's entire communities that believe this thing. Um, QAnon is a massive movement that kind of originated from 8chan. And to this day, I mean, at peak QAnon was kind of like 20, 2016 to 2020 when Trump was in office. But it's still going to this day. There's still people that are kind of deeply embedded, and that's their source of news is these underground communities, which is kind of crazy as a way to get your news. But it leads to, protests, fighting, hate crimes, vandalism, arson, all sorts of like terrible real world consequences because they've been radicalized by, things that happen things that are said that are online. Um, and one of the things I was really interested in researching was like, why do people believe these things? Why do they hear something as insane like that, and they're like, "Oh, that could be true," and maybe that's something I should uh stop telling other people. I mean, a lot of it comes from mistrust of government and authorities. There has been actual incidents where the government they make mistakes all the time. But they often try to own up to it. They get called out for it. People get fined. Sometimes even people get jail time. I mean, if you take some examples and pick them apart, you can see government failures, and it's no surprise that people mistrust governments. But it's just due to incompetency, not due to some criminal global cabal running everything secretly. It's just due to corruption and incompetency. Um, so yeah, I mean that's one of the main reasons why people believe these things. Um, a whole load of other reasons, personal connections. Sometimes, if something happens to you personally, that's you're gonna fixate on everything to do with that topic. Um, Severe confirmation bias. It's basically anytime you see something that supports your narrative, you take that on as evidence that supports your argument. But if you're presented with something that doesn't really, that's counter to what you believe, just ignore it and insist that your narrative is true. And then unfortunately, in very sad cases, it's basic uneducation, mental illness, and even sort of just loneliness in many cases. Back in the day, if you think 50 years ago before the internet, um, these kind of ideas and things were really hard to try and you weren't really coming across these things as much. It's only because of the internet and social media, um, people are more exposed to these beliefs and these conspiracies on a much more wider basis now. It's why you get more people believing it. And the thing I always find funny personally is that actual conspiracy theories, things that have happened and are very bad, people tend to not really focus on those ones that much. They kind of believe in more like flat Earth and aliens and all sort of the vaccine, the 5G vaccine chips and all sorts of crazy stuff like that. Whereas there have been actual general conspiracies that, I mean, these aren't really conspiracy theories, these are just conspiracies. Things like Epstein Island, the Snowden leaks, everything that Boris Johnson does. Partygate, his connection to the Lebedevs, the ex-Russian KGB guys, and his how his government conducted all sorts of PPE fraud during the pandemic. These are things, terrible things, and corruption and incompetency and fa law enforcement failures that people generally can be, mad about, which is I can completely understand that. Um, the other funny thing is a lot, like I've mentioned a lot of the time, how social media is responsible for this stuff. The problem with social media is that social media, like I call this the Zuckerberg-Musk dilemma, is that they have to push these things to earn a profit. And it costs them money to stop and it costs them money to monitor and moderate these platforms, which they don't want to do. They're fine to just let it perpetuate because it makes them, more money at the end of the day. They generally try to avoid some of this stuff. They're not gonna, they do ban accounts on occasion if they are reported enough and advertisers threaten to pull out enough. They do generally then start to act, but for the most part, you know, they're not stopping any of this stuff. For probably 90% of it just continues to spread. And that's why we have such a bad issue that we're in today. Um, you know, it's really hard. I mean, it is hard for these social media platforms if you have billions of users or hundreds of millions of users. It would take an absolutely insanely large amount of moderate team of moderators or so hugely sophisticated algorithm to stop it, and then they would just get blamed for censorship. But at some point there has to be a level. They have to try, in my opinion. Um, and I mean, this brings up the idea of artificial intelligence. How is artificial intelligence going to influence disinformation? I mean, this could probably be a whole talk on its own, but AI has really, turbocharged a lot of this stuff. The large language model, generative AI sort of text generation just means people can create articles faster, they can write tweets and Facebook posts faster. They can use deep fakes and audios and videos to make YouTube videos and things. You can manipulate videos, you can cut things in content, all sorts of crazy stuff that AI is capable of. As well as just straight up cybercrime, such as creating explicit sexual content to extort people, even going as far as making, child abuse material, which is, terrible. It's complete opposite of what the people who design these AI technology to do, but the criminals and organized crime gangs will always find a way. Um, and yeah, I mean, AI has caused so many issues as well as, a lot of things it's solved. We still need to think about how it's gonna, or how we need to change our ways of doing things online and information, spreading information. Should there be some sort of checking system that looks for AI generated content? So cyber-enabled disinformation, this is kind of ties it more back to some of the research and things that I normally do, as cyber threat intelligence and threat hunting. Why do, why do threat actors, how do threat actors actually leverage intrusions, breaking into networks and stealing files and data? How do they leverage that in disinformation? Well, it's quite interesting because they usually do it surrounding political events, and Russia is one of the hostile states that tends to leverage this a lot more than some of the other hostile states. Iran is pretty prone to doing this as well. They do something called hack and leak operations, which means once they get into a system, they download all the files or emails or whatever type of data it is, and then basically tactically decide to leak that at a specific point in time to get the most impact. And one of the best examples of this was in 2016, the Russian intelligence services, the military intelligence, and the foreign intelligence service, also known as the GRU and SVR, managed to break into the Democratic National Committee and managed to steal all sorts of emails and things from the Clinton campaign and leak them as well. So this was a massive hit to the credibility of the Clinton campaign, probably cost her some votes, probably helped Donald Trump a little bit. We can't really measure that exactly. But again, it's just a tactic that hostile adversaries use that we need to be aware of. Um, at the time of I'm recording this, the US presidential election is upcoming in the start of November, and Donald Trump's campaign has actually been targeted by Iranian threat actors who successfully managed to get into the email accounts of some of his campaign managers and started leaking things to all sorts of news outlets and things. A lot of the news outlets, though, were able to recognize that this was a hostile state or a malicious threat actor, and decided not to publish it and instead alert the FBI. So at least we are doing a little bit better than 2016. Some things have changed slightly, thankfully. Um, and then some of the other interesting stuff is sort of cyber-enabled disinformation. We see the news sites being compromised. One of the longest running campaigns of this type has been performed by the threat actor known as Ghostwriter. and they will actually compromise news websites and upload fictitious news articles and then spread the link to the legitimate news site. So that's another interesting way of hijacking established trust to then spread your disinformation. And another famous example is when Qatar's state media agency was compromised and again caused a bit of a diplomatic crisis in the Middle East from that hack. And I definitely recommend going and researching that one further. So how can we actually fight disinformation? I know I've been t saying about how hard it is and how difficult it is of a challenge, but there are certain things we could, like governments around the world, could be doing, and just to try and help people who are consuming this information, make it easier for them. Um, One of the key ways is labeling. So actually knowing the source of information goes a long way to actually helping to understand and evaluate it as well. So if, when you're watching when you're watching a TV show or TV news, how it comes on in the evenings and things, and they actually said where the source of information originally came from, that would probably help people think more critically about things. If you keep hearing that information is the original source is the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that immediately makes you more skeptical, or makes me more skeptical of whether the information is true or not, because it's coming from an adversary who wants you to feel a certain way or think a certain way. They have complete, total control over that information, and it's their one of their ways of which they target, you know, foreign audiences. Sovereignty is another interesting one. So national domains in cyberspace. I mean, information domains such as news websites and social media and TV channels and all these kinds of things. Um, could some government officials actually have thought of kind of considering these as sort of sovereign cyberspace in a way that if it's attacked and targeted, they can use sort of proportional response towards those as well. And then another interesting idea is that more sort of developing countries can sort of form alliances around their information domains and help each other when disinformation starts spreading and warn each other about it as well, warn each other about these campaigns. Um, and then one of the other uh, best ways to kind of counter disinformation is exposure, calling the adversaries out, explaining how these things are working. During the Russia-Ukraine when the Russia-Ukraine war was just starting, a lot of the US intelligence services were publicly exposing things. So, the Russians were looking for some sort of way to trigger the invasion in around January, February 2022. And the US was coming out and saying, exposing some of these fake ways that they were trying to trigger some sort of start for the war, some sort of surprise attack by Ukraine on Russia or something, and as a justification to invade. But the US had basically figured out that it was all staged, and called it out. But Russia still invaded anyway, but it's still interesting and useful tool in the toolbox of fighting disinformation as well. So at the end of the day, why we need to think about why we're being targeted by disinformation. Have you ever felt this constantly distracted by news bombarding your phone or your computer? Do you often feel like you're depressed whenever you read the news? Do you ever feel like people are trying to anytime you read an article, you look at the comments, people are kind of criticizing your government or your country or your organization you're a part of is just non-stop. Um, and if you do decide to share your opinion, which is a pretty thing people reluctantly don't really feel like doing these days, um, then do you just get denigrated and derided for even caring to share your information, your opinion and things? Because at the end of the day, this is how these hostile states target foreign audiences. They constantly argue with them, they constantly say how they're wrong, They use constant whataboutery. They bring up irrelevant things and don't sort of argue the main point at hand. And at the end of the day, they're trying to make these target audiences lose faith in their governments and lose faith in the system. Because if you think about when you have elections, democratic elections, if you can make people stop believing in the democratic system and stop voting, then the whole system kind of starts to erode and starts to degrade. When less than half the people vote, it kind of is causing issues. Um, so other ways to resist, if you're an actual user on the internet, how can you resist disinformation? I mean, this is important to think about whenever you're whenever you're kind of interacting with other anonymous people online. You should be cautious about these interactions. You should, always be apprehensive of who you're talking to if you don't know them. Basic stuff, really. All stats can be forged. If you see some sort of comment on Instagram or Twitter or on any other social media site, you see it's got like 10,000 likes or something crazy or a million comments or something. Those can all be botted. Those can all be manipulated. So don't take the numbers as support from other people because it can all be faked at the end of the day. Everything you see should be thought of critically. Um, Researching your sources of information. This is another, it comes down to actually doing a bit of your own research at the end of the day, thinking about what you're looking at. Like I mentioned with one of the best ways to counter it is by labeling. If you're reading the news and you see that the main sources of information are Ministry of Foreign Affairs from hostile governments, then I mean you should be skeptical about whether it's true or not because they want you to think a certain way. Um, I mean, basic stuff like checking the dates. If something is published, 10 years ago, then it's not really going to be that relevant today. Things have changed, right? And evaluating your biases. For me, for example, I live in the UK. I need to be, and I'm sort of, pro NATO and pro democracy and things. So it's important that when I consume information and when I read things about, negative things the UK government has done or negative things that NATO has done, or for example, then I should be trying to take into account my biases that I'm actually pro those sort of organizations and things, and also and try and not immediately dismiss everything I find out or I hear about from genuine investigative journalists, right? Um, but at the end of the day, disinformation is very hard to stop, and people around you are susceptible to it. They may not be taking the same steps that you take, same precautions and steps that you take to stop these things. This is kind of a good diagram because it helps you think about some of the sources of news that you get and which ways they lean politically. Um, just goes to show, you shouldn't rely on one source of news. You should be reviewing different sources of news. You should be looking at things from the left, things from the right, things from the center. It's very important to try and stay like at least in the top two rows because that's where these are sort of fact-based. You can independently check these things yourselves, and it's important just to make sure that you're not taking completely biased one-sided news with no evidence to support it, right? That's going down into the bottom half is sort of, not where you really want to be getting your news from. Some other resources I recommend. So you have fact-checking sites such as Snopes, some researchers that I follow on Twitter. You have a guy, Cheyenne, who works for BBC Verify, does some great work debunking conspiracy theories and disinformation posts. And another guy, Pekka, he often breaks down sort of these disinformation influencers and scammers and things who are, just constantly spreading the fake news and disinformation. Um, Here's a final thing. One of the final things I want you guys to think about is hacking the human brain. This is a book that came out in 1992 called Snow Crash. Great fiction read, sci-fi fiction read. Recommend you guys worth worth reading it. But basically, it's based in a sort of a cyberpunk um, future where its ability everyone kind of goes on the metaverse, but one of the people in the metaverse realized that there's this virus that if you look at this code, this scroll on this, the code on this scroll, it actually, if you can understand coding languages, it actually basically fries your brain and affects you physically. So it's kind of an interesting thing that someone thought of 30 years ago now. And it's kind of is what's happening today with disinformation campaigns. If you think back to if I show someone a conspiracy theory about how 5G is causing COVID, and someone goes and burns down a 5G tower, it's kind of a similar thing, right? Um, and it's kind of spreading at a scary, scary rate. Um, if anyone's a fan of war games, again, the best way to beat disinformation is just not to consume it if you can. Um, some more references of where I did this research and where this research came from. Some, if you want to do some further reading, definitely recommend checking out Elliot Higgins's book, We Are Bellingcat, Thinking Fast and Slow. It's all about critical thinking, sort of intelligence analysis as well. Other books, Crime.com by Jeff White, Sandworm by Andy Greenberg, and of course Snow Crash, which I just mentioned. All good things that where how I came to learn about a lot of this stuff myself. Um, but I think that's it. Thanks everyone. I appreciate everyone who made it this far. But yeah, take it easy. Hope you enjoyed.